The snow gave way with a soft crunch under Alara's worn leather boot. She held up a hand, and the two small figures behind her froze instantly, their breaths plumed in the frigid air of the Greyfang Peaks, little white ghosts against the deep green of the pines. Liam, her son, shifted his weight with the impatience of a 6-year-old. His sister Lyra remained perfectly still, a skill Alara had drilled into them since they could walk. Alara knelt, her fingers hovering over the delicate print in the snow. It was a snow hare, fresh. She beckoned them closer, her voice a low whisper that the wind seemed to carry away. "Look here," she murmured, pointing. "See how the back prints are ahead of the front ones?" It was moving fast. Frightened, Liam leaned in, his dark woolen hood slipping back just an inch. It was enough. A sliver of impossible luminous gold flashed in the flat afternoon light. Alara's heart seized. Her hand moved with a speed that was pure instinct, pulling the hood firmly back into place, her fingers lingering on the rough fabric. "Liam," she said, her voice still quiet but now laced with a sharp edge of steel. "What did I tell you?" He looked down, chastened. "Keep the hood up, always." "Always," she repeated, the single word carrying the weight of 6 years of terror. She glanced at Lyra, whose hood was securely fastened, shadowing her face completely. "Good girl." "Why, Mama?" Lyra's small voice was muffled by her scarf. "Are the mountain spirits really that Shamal?" The lie tasted like ash in Alara's mouth, the same lie she'd been telling them for years. It was a flimsy shield, but it was all she had against a truth that would shatter their small world. A truth about a king, a citadel of dark stone, and a bloodline that marked them as both royalty and targets. "They are," Alara said, forcing a gentle tone. "They are very old and very quiet. Our world is too loud for them. We must be respectful." She looked from one hooded head to the other. Their eyes, their beautiful damning eyes, were a secret that lived under a constant shadow. They were his eyes, Theron's, the molten gold of the Alpha Royal line, a dominant, unmissable trait, a brand of ownership she had run from for 2,000 days. She forced her attention back to the lesson. Survival was their only real protection. "The hare went this way, towards the rockfall. It will be looking for shelter from the wind." She stood, her own wild, dark hair whipping around her face. Her green eyes, weary but sharp, scanned the jagged landscape. This mountain was their fortress and their prison. It gave them food, water, and shelter. It hid them, but it also isolated them in a silence so profound she sometimes felt she was the last person left in the world. Her and the 2 precious heartbeats she would protect with her last breath. They followed the tracks for another hour. Liam learned how to spot the faint scrape of a claw on an icy rock. Lyra learned to listen for the dislodged pebble that signaled movement above. Alara taught them not with the simple joy of a mother sharing nature with her children, but with the grim focus of a drill sergeant preparing her recruits for a war they could never understand. Every lesson was a layer of armor. Every skill was a day stolen back from the fate that hunted them. As the sun began to dip behind the highest peaks, painting the snow in shades of pale rose and lavender, Alara called a halt. They hadn't caught the hare, but that was not the point. The point was the practice. The point was the discipline. "It's getting dark," she announced. "Time to go home." The walk back to the cabin was quiet. The children were tired, their small legs working hard to keep up with her longer strides. Alara's mind, as it often did in these unguarded moments, drifted. She could almost feel the phantom weight of a hand on her stomach, a memory from a different life. A life in the lush, manicured gardens of Stonehold Citadel, with a young alpha who had not yet become a king. A man who had whispered promises to her in the dark, promises of protection from a court that saw her as a weakness, an omega unworthy of an alpha's attention. He had promised to shield her, to shield their future. She shook her head, a violent physical rejection of the memory. That man was gone. In his place was King Theron, the Wolf of Stonehold, a ruler known for his cold fury and merciless grip. The heartbreak she had left in her wake had, by all accounts, reforged him into something hard and cruel. He believed she had betrayed him. He had no idea she had fled not from him, but for them. For the secret she carried, the 2 lives the court elders would have snuffed out before they could draw their first breath. A child born of an Omega could never be accepted. They would have been called a blight, an impurity in the royal line. They would have been a reason to challenge Theron's own claim. So she had run, trading a silken cage for a frozen wilderness. Their cabin was nestled so cleverly into a fold of the mountain that you could be 10 feet from it and never know it was there. Built of stout timber and local stone, with a roof covered in living sod, it was more a part of the landscape than a structure upon it. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin gray thread she only allowed after dusk. Inside, the warmth was immediate and welcome. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The single room was sparse but clean. A rough-hewn table and 3 stools stood in the center. A large bed piled with furs occupied one corner, and shelves holding dried herbs, preserved food, and wooden bowls lined the walls. It smelled of pine, wood smoke, and the rabbit stew she had left simmering that morning. It was the scent of home, their only home. While the children shed their damp outer layers and huddled by the fire, Alara stirred the stew. She watched the steam rise, her thoughts swirling with it. This life was hard. Some days the loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that longed for another adult voice, for a touch that was not from a small child's hand. But then she would look at Liam and Lyra, their faces glowing in the firelight, and the ache would recede. They were safe. They were hers. That was all that mattered. "I almost had him, Lyra," Liam boasted, his earlier scolding forgotten. He held up his hands to show the distance. "He was that close. If I had my own bow, I would have got him." "You would have fallen in the snow," Lyra retorted, not unkindly. "You were looking at your feet." "Was not." "Was too." Alara smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of her face. She ladled the thick stew into 3 wooden bowls. "Enough, you two. Eat. You need your strength." They ate at the small table, their conversation a low, happy buzz. They talked about the hare, about a hawk they had seen circling, about whether the ice on the creek was thick enough to slide on yet. To them, this was just life, an adventure. They had no memory of anything else. They did not know that other children lived in stone houses in bustling towns, that they slept in beds with woven blankets instead of furs, that they did not have to practice hiding in the root cellar whenever a strange noise echoed through the valley. The thought sent a familiar chill down her spine. The root cellar, the last resort, a dark, cramped hole under the floorboards, hidden by a bearskin rug. They had drilled the procedure 100 times. At her signal, they were to drop everything, lift the rug, pull the iron ring, and scramble down into the darkness without a sound. She prayed to the old gods every night that they would never have to use it for real. After they had eaten and the bowls were scraped clean, Lyra padded over to her, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She tugged on Alara's sleeve. "A story, Mama? Before sleep?" Liam's head popped up. "Yes, a story about the wolves." Alara's heart did a strange little flip. It was always the wolves. She looked at her son, his dark hair a wild tangle, his face earnest. He was so much like his father in looks, not just the eyes. The strong set of his jaw, the way he stood, feet planted firmly as if he owned the ground beneath them. It terrified her. She sighed, feigning a weariness she did not feel. "All right, one story, then bed." She herded them to the large mattress, tucking them in under the heavy weight of the wolf and bearskin pelts. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, filling the cabin with a soft, red light. Alara sat on the edge of the bed, the straw-filled mattress rustling beneath her. She took a deep breath, gathering the threads of the tale she had woven for them over the years. A story that was their own, cloaked in myth. "A long time ago," she began, her voice a hush, "in the heart of the great forest, there lived a mother wolf. She was swift and clever, but she was born under a quiet moon, and the rest of the pack did not understand her worth." She absently touched the faint silvery crescent-shaped scar on her inner wrist, the exil's mark, a permanent reminder of her Omega status, of the clan's judgment. "One day," she continued, "the great alpha of all the packs saw her. He saw the strength she kept hidden, and the loyalty in her heart, and against the laws of the pack, he chose her." Liam snuggled deeper into the furs. "And they had cubs." "They had cubs," Ilara affirmed, her voice catching for a fraction of a second. Two of them, a boy and a girl, and they were special. They were not born with fur of gray or black. They were born with starlight caught in their coats, a magic that shone for all to see. She paused, letting the image settle. But the pack was jealous. The elders whispered that these cubs were a bad omen, that they would bring ruin. They wanted to cast the cubs out into the cold. Lyra's hand found hers in the dark. But the alpha would protect them. Ilara's throat felt tight. How do you explain to a child that their father, a king, was powerful but not all-powerful? That politics were a tide that could drown even the strongest swimmer? The alpha wanted to, she said carefully. But a great, shadowy hunter began to roam the forest. He was a hunter who had lost something precious long ago, and the loss had made his heart cold and hard. He heard tales of the starlight cubs, and he believed they were what had been stolen from him. He wanted them back, not to love them, but to own them, to lock their magic away. Is the hunter bad? Lyra whispered. The question hung in the air. Was Theron bad? Or was he just a man drowning in grief, a grief she had caused? Had his cruelty grown from the wound she had left? He is lost, Ilara finally answered, the word feeling true and false at the same time. And lost things can be dangerous. They thrash about and they don't care who they hurt. But the mother wolf is stronger, Liam said. It was not a question. It was a statement of faith, his faith in her. A wave of fierce, desperate love washed over Ilara, so potent it almost buckled her. She had to be, she whispered, stroking his hair. So before the hunter could find them, the mother wolf took her cubs and fled. She ran for days and nights, over rivers and through thorns, until she reached the highest mountains, the peaks that scraped the sky. And there, in a secret den, she raised her cubs in peace, where the hunter's shouts could not reach and his eyes could not find them. She finished the story and they were quiet, the familiar tale a comforting blanket. Soon their breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Ilara stayed seated for a long time, watching their peaceful faces in the dying light of the fire. Liam's hood had fallen away completely in his sleep, and in the faint glow his closed eyelids seemed to shimmer with the gold beneath them. Her beautiful, impossible children, her glorious, terrifying secret. Every sacrifice was worth this. Every cold night, every hungry day, every moment of soul-crushing loneliness. It was all a price she would pay 1,000 times over to keep them safe in this hidden den. Finally, she stood up, her joints protesting the cold. She added a single log to the fire, just enough to keep the chill at bay until morning. She picked up Liam's tunic from the floor, where he had discarded it. There was a small tear in the sleeve. Taking a needle and thread from a pouch on the shelf, she sat in her stool by the cabin's single small window, her back to the fire. The moon was nearly full, casting a stark, silver light over the snow-covered valley. The world outside was silent. It was a silence she had come to know intimately, the silence of wind, of snow, of vast, empty space. For 6 years, this profound quiet had been her shield, her co-conspirator. It was the sound of safety. Her fingers moved automatically, the needle dipping in and out of the rough spun cloth. Her gaze was fixed on the landscape, her mind empty. It was in these moments, after the children were asleep and her duties for the day were done, that the solitude pressed in the hardest. She was Ilara, just Ilara. Not a mother, not a teacher, not a protector, a woman alone at the top of the world. She traced the silvery crescent scar on her wrist, the brand that declared her an outcast, a runaway. To the world she had left behind, a traitor. Suddenly her needle froze mid-stitch. Her head snapped up. There was a sound. It was faint at first, thin and sharp, cutting through the thick silence of the night. It was a sound that did not belong here. It was not the howl of a wolf or the cry of a nightbird. It was man-made. She held her breath, straining to hear, praying she had imagined it. And then it came again, closer this time, clearer. It echoed off the stone faces of the peaks, a deep, brazen call that vibrated in the very air. A hunting horn. It was not the simple horn of a lone trapper signaling his position. This sound was layered, resonant, carrying the unmistakable authority of a military signal. It was a sound from her other life, a sound she had last heard in the forest surrounding Stonehold Citadel. Ilara's blood turned to ice in her veins. Her grip on the small tunic was so tight her knuckles were white. She stared out into the pristine, empty valley, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had not heard that sound in 6 years, not since the night she had vanished, leaving a king to wake up in a cold bed, alone among, and now it was here, in her sanctuary. The hunter was no longer a shadow in a story. He was in her mountains. The sound was a ghost. For 6 years, the mountains had been silent. Their voices the wind and the cry of the hawk. Their heartbeat the slow crunch of snow underfoot. That single, brazen note from a hunting horn was an echo from another life, a world of stone walls and cold-eyed courtiers. It sliced through the quiet of the cabin and struck Alara like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs. Her hand, which had been resting on the worn wooden table, flew to her chest as if to hold her heart inside her ribs. It was a sound of pursuit, of command, the sound of the king's men. Her eyes snapped to the sleeping forms of her children, curled together on their straw-filled mattress. Liam and Lyra. Their chests rose and fell in the easy, untroubled rhythm of childhood. In sleep, their faces were unguarded, free from the constant, low-level tension she had taught them to wear like a second skin. For a moment, she was paralyzed by a love so fierce it was indistinguishable from terror. They were her world, her reason, her crime, and that sound, that terrible, arrogant blast of brass and air, was here to unmake it all. The second horn blast came a minute later, closer this time, its call sharper against the frigid air. It was no longer a ghost. It was a predator, and it was climbing the slopes of her sanctuary. The paralysis broke. She moved with a speed born of years of imagining this exact moment. With silent, practiced hands, she snuffed out the single tallow lamp, plunging the small cabin into near total darkness. The only light was the faint, dying orange glow from the embers in the hearth. It cast long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar shapes of their home into looming threats. She crept to the small, deerskin-covered window, her bare feet making no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. The cold of the woods seeped into her skin, a familiar and grounding sensation. She pressed her face close to the edge of the frame, peering through a tiny gap she had purposefully left in the covering. Her breath fogged in the air before her, a small, fleeting cloud. Down below, in the dense blackness of the lower woods, she saw them, not as men, but as a chain of angry, moving stars. Torches, perhaps a dozen of them, maybe more, bobbing and weaving through the trees. They moved with a terrifying discipline. Not the scattered, random pattern of lost travelers or local hunters. This was a patrol, a line of trained men sweeping the forest in a coordinated grid. They were moving uphill, towards her. A cold sweat broke out on her back, despite the chill in the room. Her stomach twisted into a knot of pure acid dread. They were not just passing through. They were searching. For what? A rogue wolf? A bandit? Her mind scrambled for a plausible reason, any reason that was not the one she knew in her bones to be true. After 6 years of silence, 6 years of being a forgotten ghost, he had sent them. Theron. She tore herself away from the window, her mind a whirlwind of panicked calculations. How much time did she have? An hour? Less? The patrol was moving steadily. The terrain was difficult, but they were soldiers of the Wolf Clan, hardened to the mountains. She could not outrun them, not with 2 small children, not in the dark. Hiding was their only chance, their only hope. Liam, Lyra. Her voice was a harsh whisper, a sound meant to cut through sleep without carrying beyond the walls of the cabin. She crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside their mattress. She put a hand on each of their shoulders, her grip firm, urgent. Wake up, now. Liam stirred first, a soft groan escaping his lips. His dark hair, so like her own, was a messy tangle across his forehead. Lyra, ever the lighter sleeper, blinked her eyes open, her small face clouded with confusion. In the faint ember glow, their eyes were just dark pools, their dangerous, luminous secret hidden by the shadows. Mama? Lyra's voice was thick with sleep. What's wrong? The winter hunt, Alara said, the code phrase a stone in her throat. She had drilled them on it 100 times, turning the life-or-death procedure into a grim sort of game. A game they had to win. It's time. Quickly. You know what to do. Understanding dawned on Liam's whites, chasing away the last remnants of sleep. His expression tightened into a miniature version of the serious, focused look she saw in her own reflection. He sat up immediately, his movements quick and sure. He reached for the small leather packs they kept at the foot of their bed, grabbing one for himself and pushing the other toward his sister. Inside each was a water skin, a length of dried meat, and a spare pair of woolen socks, the barest essentials for a night spent in the cold dark. Lyra, however, hesitated, her brow furrowed. But it's dark. It's not morning. It doesn't matter what time it is, Alara snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She saw a flicker of fear in her daughter's eyes and her heart ached. She softened her tone, forcing a calm she did not feel. The game has started, my love, and we have to be the winners. Remember? We have to be the quietest mice in the whole forest. She helped Lyra sit up, her fingers fumbling with the ties on the girl's tunic. Her own hands were trembling. She had to force them to be still. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Panic was loud. Panic got you caught. She pulled their thick woolen cloaks over their shoulders, her hands automatically going to the deep hoods. Hoods up, always. The children obeyed without question, pulling the dark wool low over their faces until their features were lost in shadow. It was a gesture as ingrained in them as breathing. They looked like two small, faceless monks, their identities erased. It was a cruel necessity, a constant reminder of the secret they carried in their gaze. Good, Alara whispered, her eyes darting back toward the window. The torches seemed closer now, a creeping line of fire climbing her mountain. Now, where do you go? To the cellar, Liam answered promptly, his voice muffled by his hood. Under the rug. And what is the first rule? We never make a sound, the twins recited in unison, their voices small and solemn. It was a catechism of survival she had taught them from the moment they could understand words. And the second rule. There was a slight pause. Liam looked at Lyra. Lyra looked at the floor. Lyra? Alara pressed, her voice tight with urgency. We never ever open the door, Lyra whispered. Not for anyone. Not even you, Mama. Not unless you give the signal. What is the signal? 3 knocks, Liam said. Then 2 more, like a rabbit's heartbeat. Good, very good. Alara's relief was a sharp, painful pang. They remembered. She had prepared them. But a drill was not the same as the hunt. A game was not the same as the cold steel of a soldier's sword. She stood and moved to the center of the room, to the large worn bearskin rug that covered most of the floor. It was heavy, its fur thick and coarse beneath her feet. With a grunt of effort, she grabbed one edge and folded it back, exposing the dark, cold floorboards beneath. There, nestled between 2 planks, was a small iron ring, worn smooth with time. This was the entrance to their sanctuary. Their tomb. A shallow root cellar, barely 4 feet deep and 6 feet long, dug out of the cold earth beneath the cabin. It smelled of damp soil and potatoes. It was where they stored their winter provisions, but it had been built for this. It was dark, cramped, and terrifying. And it was the safest place in the world. All right, she commanded softly. In, now. Liam went first, climbing down the short, sturdy ladder with practiced ease. He reached the bottom and looked up, a small, hooded shadow waiting in the dark. Lyra followed more hesitantly. She paused at the top, her small hand gripping the edge of the opening. She turned her head, the movement slow, her face still hidden by the cowl of her cloak. Mama, she said, her voice trembling slightly, why are the king's men bad? The question stopped Alara cold. It was so simple, so innocent, so impossible to answer. How could she explain it? How could she tell her 6-year-old daughter that the king was her father, that the men climbing the mountain were her father's men, sworn to protect his bloodline? How could she explain that the very thing that made them royal, the mark of their heritage, was also the thing that could get them killed? She could not tell them that their father, a man she had once loved with a desperate, all-consuming passion, was now a figure of terror in the stories she told them. A shadowy hunter, a cold-hearted king. She could not explain the politics of the court, The vicious whispers about an Omega bearing an Alpha's heir. The threats that had driven her into this exile. To tell them that would be to destroy the last vestiges of their childhood. To tell them that would be to explain that their own father would not recognize them. Or worse, that if he did, his love had long ago curdled into a possessive fury that might see them as leverage, as weapons, or as a final bitter reminder of her perceived betrayal. She knelt down, her face level with Lyra's hidden one. She could feel the child's fear, a palpable thing radiating from her small body. Alara reached out and placed her hand on Lyra's cheek, her thumb stroking the soft fabric of the hood. "They aren't all bad, my love," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "They are just following orders. But their king, the man they serve, he doesn't understand. He is looking for something he lost a long time ago, and he is angry." "What did he lose?" Liam's small voice piped up from the darkness below. Ilara's heart clenched. She thought of a younger Theron, his laugh echoing in a moonlit garden, his molten gold eyes soft with a love she had believed was invincible. She thought of his hand on her stomach, a silent promise to a child he did not yet know existed. He had lost her, and in losing her, he had lost himself. But she could not say that. "It doesn't matter what he lost," she said, her voice hardening again, pulling back from the precipice of memory. "All that matters is us. All that matters is that they can never, ever see your eyes. Do you understand me, Lyra? That is the most important rule, more important than anything. It is the one rule that keeps us safe. It keeps us together." She saw a small, jerky nod from beneath the hood. It was enough. "Good girl. Now get down there with your brother. Be brave." Lyra finally released her grip and scurried down the ladder. Alara watched her disappear into the gloom below. For a second, she saw two pairs of eyes, luminous and golden, reflecting the faint light from the hearth. The royal eyes, the king's eyes, her beautiful, terrible secret. Then Liam pulled his sister further into the shadows, and they were gone. Her hands shook as she lowered the heavy trap door into place. The fit was snug, designed to be almost seamless with the surrounding floorboards. The iron ring clanked softly as it settled into its groove. She quickly unrolled the bearskin rug, smoothing it out, erasing any sign of the door beneath. She took a deep breath, scanning the cabin. The two small packs were gone. The mattress showed the indentation of two sleeping children. But that was normal. It looked like the home of a lone woman, just as it was supposed to. Just as she straightened up, a powerful gust of wind slammed against the side of the cabin, rattling the window frame and sending a puff of soot down the chimney. The embers in the hearth hissed and glowed brighter for a moment. Another gust followed, this one carrying a high, mournful whistle as it tore through the pines outside. Alara went back to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She peered through the gap again. The torches were closer, much closer now. She could almost make out the individual shapes of the men holding them. But something else was happening. The air around the torches was becoming thick, hazy. A single white flake drifted past the gap in the deerskin. Then another, and another. Within a minute, the air was filled with them. A cascade of thick, heavy flakes, swirling and dancing in the wind. A blizzard. It was descending on the mountain with the mountain with breathtaking speed. A sudden, violent squall born of the high peaks. The torches below began to waver, their light diffusing in the thickening snow. The world was turning white. Alara felt a strange, dual sensation, a surge of hope in a wave of deeper fear. The snow could be their salvation. It could blanket the mountain, cover their tracks, and hide the little cabin from sight. It could force the patrol to turn back, to abandon their search in the face of the storm's fury. Or it could trap them. It could force the soldiers to seek shelter. And on this desolate, frozen slope, there was only one shelter to be found. Her cabin. The snow was a curtain falling between her and her hunters. But she didn't know if it was a curtain to hide behind or one that was about to rise on the final terrible act. The wind howled, no longer a whistle but a roar, and the heavy snow fell, promising to either save her or to deliver the enemy directly to her door. The snow came down not in flakes but in a solid blinding sheet. It was a wall of white erasing the world Alara knew, The jagged peaks, the dark line of the woods, even the tree just a few yards from her window, all vanished. The wind howled, a hungry animal clawing at the little cabin's wooden walls. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft, even breathing of her children. Liam and Lyra were burrowed under a pile of furs, their faces slack with sleep, blessedly unaware of the closing net. The blizzard was a monster, but for now it was their monster. It kept the soldiers at bay, but it also locked Alara in a cage with her own thoughts. She ran a hand over the frosted window pane, her fingers tracing patterns in the ice. The cold bit at her skin, a familiar sting that did nothing to numb the terror coiling in her gut. 6 years. For 6 years, this isolation had been her shield. The silence of the mountains was a lullaby. The harshness of the seasons, a predictable enemy she could fight and win against. Now, the silence was filled with the phantom echo of that hunting horn. The world she had run from had finally found its way up the mountain, and the cold on her fingertips dragged a memory up from a place she kept locked away. A memory of a different kind of cold, and a warmth so intense it had almost destroyed her. The air in the royal gardens had been thick with the scent of moon petal blossoms and damp earth. It was a summer night years ago, the sky a velvet black pricked with 1,000 diamond stars. She had been sitting on a marble bench hidden away in a secluded alcove, the smooth stone cool against her legs. Distant music from a royal banquet drifted on the breeze, a faint melody of strings and laughter that felt a world away. She was not meant to be there. And Omega, even one favored by the Alpha King, was not to linger in the heart of the palace after dark. Every shadow felt like a watching eye, every rustle of leaves a whispered condemnation. Then he had appeared, moving through the darkness with a predator's grace. Theron. He was not the king then, not in that moment. He was just a man, his imposing frame softened by the moonlight, the heavy weight of his crown temporarily set aside. He wore no formal armor, just a simple black tunic that did little to hide the power in his shoulders and chest. He said nothing as he sat beside her, the bench suddenly feeling very small. The air crackled with his presence. He smelled of night air, of steel, and of a scent that was uniquely his, a scent of dominance and safety that both terrified and thrilled her. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her inner wrist. He paused, his touch tracing the faint, silvery crescent branded there, the exile's mark. A shame she had carried since she was a girl, punishment for a minor transgression her family had committed long ago. Most in the court pretended not to see it. Theron was the only one who ever touched it. He did not flinch from it. Instead, he treated it like just another part of her. "They whisper about you in the halls," he had said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone bench. "The vipers, they hiss about an Omega in the Alpha's shadow." Alara kept her eyes on their joined hands. Her own looked so small and pale next to his. "Let them hiss," she had whispered, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Words are only wind." "Not in this place," he countered, his tone hardening slightly. "Here, words are daggers. They are poison. They seek to cut you away from me." He turned her hand over, his gaze intense. In the low light, his eyes were not the molten gold that terrified his enemies. They were softer, like liquid honey, holding a possessive fire that was meant only for her. "I will not let them. You are mine, Alara. Do you understand that? No matter what they say, no matter who you were before, you are mine now." She had understood. Oh, she had. In his world of rigid hierarchy, of alphas and betas and the omegas at the bottom, his claim was a rebellion. It was a dangerous, reckless thing, and it was everything she wanted. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling the solid warmth of him. For the first time in her life, she felt anchored. She felt safe. He was her fortress. He shifted, his free hand coming to rest on her stomach, still flat beneath the simple fabric of her dress. His touch was so gentle, a stark contrast to the raw power she knew he possessed. He held his palm there, a silent question in the gesture. He did not know her secret yet, not for certain, but he was an alpha. He was attuned to her in ways she did not fully comprehend. He could sense the subtle shift in her, the new life blooming in the deepest, most hidden part of her, a life that carried his blood. I will build a world where they cannot touch you, he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with a solemn promise. A world where this, his fingers flexed slightly on her wrist, over the scar, means nothing. And no one will ever threaten what is mine. She had closed her eyes, a single tear of pure, unadulterated hope escaping to trace a path down her cheek. She believed him. With every fiber of her being, she believed in his strength, in his love, in the fortress of his arms. She had rested her own hand over his, a silent confirmation. Our secret, our future. In that perfect, stolen moment, surrounded by the scent of flowers and the promise of a king, she had allowed herself to dream of a life without fear. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the warmth of his hand, but the howling of the blizzard outside her cabin was a cruel reminder. The warmth was gone. The fortress had crumbled before it was ever truly built. As if summoned by the wind's shriek, another memory ripped through the first, this one cold and sharp as a shard of glass. The sweet scent of jasmine was replaced by the dry, dusty smell of old scrolls and beeswax. The gentle moonlight was gone, replaced by the sterile, unforgiving light of a single candle in a windowless room. She was not in the garden. She was standing before one of the court's elders, a man so old his skin was like parchment, his eyes like chips of flint. He had summoned her 2 days after that night with Theron. He had not been unkind. His cruelty was of a different sort, a dispassionate, procedural coldness that was far more terrifying than any overt anger. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated facts as if reading from a ledger. "You carry the Alpha's child," he said. It was not a question. His gaze dropped to her stomach, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty stone room. She felt exposed, violated. She had tried to be brave. She had lifted her chin, just as Theron would have. "I am under the king's protection," she stated, her voice trembling only slightly. The elder gave a dry, rasping chuckle, a sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "The king's protection extends to his chosen mate, to a suitable alpha or high-ranking beta, to the woman who will give him strong, pure-blooded heirs to continue the line. His protection does not and cannot extend to a temporary dalliance. It does not extend to an omega." He leaned forward, the candlelight carving deep shadows into his wrinkled face. "Our laws are not suggestions, girl. They are the bones of this clan. They are what keep us strong. An alpha's power must remain undiluted. It is a sacred fire. Your blood, your omega nature is water. It would not temper the flame, it would extinguish it." Ilara's hand instinctively went to her stomach, a protective gesture. "It is his child," she whispered, her defiance crumbling into a desperate plea. "It is a blight," the elder corrected her, his voice devoid of all emotion. "It is a weakness, a vulnerability his enemies, both inside this court and outside our borders, would exploit without a moment's hesitation. A child of mixed blood, of an alpha and an omega, can never be allowed to have a claim, however small. It would create instability. It would invite challenge. It would be a stain on the royal line that must be cleansed." Cleansed. The word hung in the air, clinical and monstrous. She could not breathe. The walls of the small room seemed to be closing in. She thought of Theron's promise, his vow to protect her. But the elder was right. Theron was powerful, but he was not yet all-powerful. He was surrounded by men like this, men who saw tradition as an unbreachable wall and saw her as a crack in the foundation. They would not see a baby. They would see a problem to be solved. "What you carry is a threat to the very king you claim to love," the elder continued, his flinty eyes boring into her. "If its existence becomes known, the council will act. Theron's hand will be forced. He will be made to choose between his duty and his affection. And the Alpha King always chooses duty. Always." He paused, letting the terrible weight of his words settle upon her. For the good of the clan, for the stability of the throne, and for the life of the king himself, such a child cannot be born within these walls. If it is, it will be seen as an abomination. And abominations, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, are eliminated. Eliminated, not killed, not murdered. The word was so clean, so final. It was the sterile language of a man erasing a mistake from a history book. He was telling her in no uncertain terms that if she stayed, her child would be taken from her. Her baby would cease to exist, and the world would move on as if it had never been. Her love for Theron, her hope for a future, it all turned to ash in her mouth. His promise to protect her was a beautiful lie, a dream from which she had just been violently awakened. He could not protect her from this. He could not protect their child from the very laws that gave him his power. She had stumbled from that room, her mind a maelstrom of terror. She saw the truth with horrifying clarity. To stay was to sentence her child to death. To stay was to force Theron into an impossible choice that would break him or force him to betray her. Her only option, the only act of love she had left to give either of them, was to disappear, to become a ghost, to take the secret with her and vanish so completely that no one would ever find her that night with nothing but a small pouch of coins and the clothes on her back. She had fled the citadel. She had run, leaving behind the only man she had ever loved to save the children he would never know he had. The memory faded, leaving behind an ache so profound it felt like a physical wound. The warmth of the fire in her cabin did nothing to combat the deep internal chill. She looked at Liam and Lyra, their chests rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Her brave partner, her bright girl. They were not a blight. They were not a stain. They were her entire world. They were perfect, and they had his eyes. The one part of him she could never erase, the golden proof of their heritage that could get them killed. Her gaze fell upon her own wrist, the pale silvery crescent of the exile's mark seeming to glow faintly in the firelight. The elder had been wrong about one thing, and Omega's love was not water. It was not weakness. It was a flood. It was a hurricane. It was a force of nature fierce enough to abandon a king and raise two children at the edge of the world. It was a love that would burn down anyone who tried to harm them. The blizzard raged on, its fury a match for her own. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind and snow. For a moment, everything was lost in the roaring gale. The past, the present, the terror, the love. It all swirled together into a single, unbearable point of pressure inside her chest. Then a new sound cut through the storm. It was sharp, loud, and impossibly close. It was not the wind. It was not a falling branch. It was a hard, authoritative knock rattling the very bones of the cabin door. The knock was not a request. It was a command, a hard, splintering sound of wood striking wood that vibrated through the floor and up Alara's spine. For a single, frozen second, the world stopped. The howling wind, the crackle of the fire, the frantic beat of her own heart, all of it went silent. There was only the echo of that single authoritative strike. Then the silence shattered and chaos took its place. Her mind, a frozen lake just a moment before, cracked into 1,000 panicked thoughts. They were here, not in the valley, not in the woods. They were at her door. Her eyes snapped to Liam and Lyra, who were huddled together near the hearth, their small faces pale with a fear they did not fully understand. Lyra's lip trembled. A small whimper caught in her throat. Liam, ever the little protector, put a hand on his sister's shoulder, his small body tense like a cornered animal. They looked at her, their wide, terrified eyes seeking an answer she did not have. There was no time for comfort. There was no time for explanation. There was only survival. Move. Now, the cellar. The words were not spoken. They were a primal scream inside her own head. She lunged forward, her movements economical and swift, honed by 6 years of constant low-grade terror. She grabbed each child by an arm, her grip firm, almost painful. Lyra let out a small gasp, but Alara pulled them along, her focus absolute. The thick bearskin rug lay before the stone hearth. It was their one secret, their single desperate gambit. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she kicked the edge of the heavy rug, rolling it back with a grunt. The rough, cured hide scraped against the floorboards, revealing the dark, aged wood beneath. In the center was a small, almost invisible iron ring, flush with the planks. It was their escape hatch, their tomb. Liam knew the drill. He dropped to his knees, his small fingers fumbling to work the cold ring out of its recess. "Hurry," Alara whispered, her voice a raw, desperate hiss. Another knock, louder this time, shook the entire cabin. It was the sound of a gauntleted fist, impatient, demanding. Liam got the ring free and pulled. The trap door, a heavy square of reinforced oak, resisted for a moment, then groaned open with the sound of tortured wood. A wave of cold, damp air rose from the darkness below, carrying the scent of earth, potatoes, and fear. It was a root cellar, barely 4 feet deep, just large enough for two small children to curl up in. She pushed Lyra toward the opening first. The little girl hesitated, her eyes wide with dread as she peered into the blackness. "Mama, it's dark," she whimpered, her voice trembling. "I know, my love. Be brave for me," Alara urged, her own voice cracking. She kissed Lyra's forehead, a quick, desperate press of her lips. "Like the wolf cubs in the den. Be silent. Be still." She helped her daughter down the short, rickety ladder. Lyra's small feet found the earthen floor, and she looked up, a tiny silhouette in a pit of darkness. Liam went next without a word, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew this was not a game. He slid down the ladder and immediately pulled his sister close, wrapping his arms around her. They were a single trembling shadow in the hole beneath the floor. Alara leaned over the opening, her own shadow falling across them. "No matter what you hear," she said, her voice dropping to the lowest possible whisper. "No matter what happens, you do not make a sound. You do not move. You do not exist. Do you understand me?" Two small heads nodded in the gloom. Liam's voice, small but firm, came back up to her. "We'll be quiet, Mama." Tears burned the back of her eyes, hot and sharp, but she choked them down. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. She had to be the rock. She had to be the wall between her children and the world that would destroy them. With a final, agonizing look, she began to close the heavy door. The last thing she saw was two pairs of eyes, glimmering in the faint firelight. Two pairs of impossible, luminous, molten gold eyes. The eyes of a king. The eyes that would get them killed. The trapdoor settled into place with a dull, final thud, sealing them in darkness. Her hand shook violently as she unrolled the bearskin rug back into place, kicking at the edges to make it look undisturbed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of pure panic. Who was she now? A lone woman? A widow? Someone who had sought solitude in the unforgiving peaks. She had practiced this role in her mind 1,000 times, but her body refused to obey. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her palms were slick with sweat. A third knock came, this one like a crack of thunder. A voice followed, deep and muffled by the door and the howling wind, but carrying the unmistakable weight of military command. "Open this door in the name of the king." The king, Theron. The name was a shard of ice in her gut. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the air into her lungs. She smoothed her tunic, pushed a stray strand of dark hair from her face, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as it reached for the simple wooden latch. She had to project fear, yes, but the right kind of fear. The fear of a lone woman startled by strangers, not the terror of a fugitive about to be discovered. She closed her eyes for a half second, picturing her children huddled in the dirt below. "Be silent. Be still. Please." She lifted the latch. The door flew inward, pushed by a gust of wind so violent it sent embers dancing from the hearth and nearly tore the door from its leather hinges. Cold and snow swirled into the small cabin, instantly stealing the precious warmth. Standing on her doorstep were 4 figures, black silhouettes against the swirling, white chaos of the blizzard. They were massive, clad in the dark-plated armor of the king's elite guard. Snow clung to their shoulders and helmets, and their breath plumed in the frigid air. The man at the front stepped forward, ducking his head to enter the low doorway. He removed his helmet, shaking the snow from it. The face that was revealed was one Alara had seen before, in the courtyards of Stonehold Citadel, always standing a few paces behind the king. It was weathered, lined with the harsh realities of a soldier's life, and framed by short, graying hair. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. Captain Kael, Theron's most loyal and trusted commander. The man Theron would send to hunt down his worst enemies. A wave of nausea washed over her. Of all the soldiers and all the patrols, it had to be him. The one man who might remember her face. Kael's gaze swept the room in a single practice motion. It took in the smallness of the space, the single cot in the corner, the meager fire, the pot of water simmering over it. His eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the two wooden cups sitting on the mantelpiece before moving on. He didn't comment on them, but Alara felt his observation like a physical touch. A cold dread trickled down her spine. It was a stupid mistake, a careless, fatal mistake. She lived alone, yet there were two cups. "Apologies for the intrusion, madam," Kael said, his voice clipped and formal, but not unkind. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "I am Captain Kell of the King's Guard. We are tracking a rogue wolf, a large, aggressive male that has been threatening the lower settlements. The trail led up into these peaks before the storm hit." He gestured with his helmet back toward the blizzard, a wall of impenetrable, churning snow. "My men and I are caught. We require shelter until the storm passes. We will be gone by morning." It was a request, but it was phrased like a statement of fact. He was not truly asking for permission. Alara's mind raced. To refuse would be an act of defiance, an immediate red flag. Why would a lone woman turn away the king's own guard in a life-threatening storm? It would invite questions, suspicion, and possibly force. But to let them in, to let them stand here on this very floor with her children just inches beneath their feet, the thought was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting footstep would be a new form of torture. She clutched her arms around herself, a gesture she hoped looked like a woman chilled by the open door, and not one trying to hold herself together. "A wolf?" she asked, her voice thin and slightly shaky. She pitched it higher than her natural tone, making herself sound more fragile. "I have not seen any wolf, only the usual packs, and they keep their distance." One of the soldiers behind Kael, a younger man with a nervous energy, stamped his feet. "It's a demon, this one," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Killed 3 of Lord Valerius's sheep and nearly took the shepherd's arm off." Kael shot the young soldier a silencing glare before turning his attention back to Alara. His gaze was intense, searching. He was evaluating her, trying to place her. "You live here? Alone?" he asked, his tone neutral, but the question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The Grey-Fang Peaks were no place for the solitary. They were for outcasts, exiles, and those with something to hide. Alara felt the faint silvery scar on her wrist begin to itch, a phantom sensation that always came with fear. The exile's mark, a permanent reminder of who she was, of what she had been cast out for. She instinctively tucked her hand behind her back out of his line of sight. "My husband passed some years ago," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I prefer the quiet." She looked down at the floor, hoping it would be seen as shyness or grief. She could not meet his eyes any longer, terrified of what he might see there, terrified he might see Theron's ghost haunting her features. Kael was silent for a long moment. The only sounds were the howling of the blizzard and the frantic thumping of her own blood in her ears. She could feel his stare on the top of her head. He was reading the room, reading her, the single cot, the small stores of firewood, the feminine touches, few as they were, a bit of dried lavender hanging from a rafter, a carefully mended blanket, and the 2 cups. Always her mind returned to the 2 cups. Please don't ask, she prayed to gods she no longer believed in. Please don't ask about the cups. He took another step into the room, followed by his men. They filled the small space, their dark, imposing forms and the cold radiating from their armor, making the cabin feel suddenly like a cage. The smell of wet metal, leather, and pine filled the air, overwhelming the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. They were an invasion, an occupying force in her tiny, fragile world. "The storm is worsening," Kael stated simply. "We will not survive the night out there." He looked directly at her, and this time his expression held a flicker of something else. Not suspicion, but a weary pragmatism. He was a soldier, and this was a matter of logistics. Shelter was shelter. "We will not trouble you. We only need a roof and a fire. We have our own rations." Alara's choices had narrowed to one. A refusal now would be a death sentence for them, and an act so suspicious it would guarantee her own destruction. She had to let the wolves into the den. She had to stand over her hidden cubs and pretend she was alone. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. She forced her body to relax, to unclench. She let out a long, slow breath, feigning weary resignation. She gave a small, reluctant nod. "The storm is a bad one," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "You may stay." She stepped back from the door, making space for them to enter fully. The four men moved past her, their heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. One of them stepped directly onto the center of the bearskin rug. The floor beneath him gave a faint, almost imperceptible creak. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Her entire body went rigid. Down below in the suffocating dark, had Liam and Lyra heard it? Had they flinched? Had one of them made a sound? The soldier seemed not to notice. He moved toward the fire, extending his frozen, gauntleted hands toward the warmth. The other men began to remove their helmets and shed the outer layers of their snow-caked cloaks. They were making themselves at home, in her home, right on top of her children. Captain Kale stood near the door, his sharp eyes still moving, still assessing. He looked at her, a silent question in his gaze, an invitation for her to say more, to explain the emptiness of the cabin, the solitude. It was the final test. Alara took a steadying breath, the lie solidifying in her mind. It had to be perfect. It had to be unshakable. Her heart pounded a desperate, frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was quiet and steady. She hugged her arms to her chest and looked at the captain, the picture of a lonely, wary widow. "You may have shelter," she repeated, her voice firm now. "But understand, there is little room. I live alone." The small cabin was thick with the smell of wet wool and melting snow. Four soldiers, clad in the black and silver of the king's elite guard, filled the space, their presence shrinking the room to a cage. Alara moved with a deliberate, practiced calm, her hands steady as she ladled a thin turnip broth into wooden bowls. Inside her, a frantic bird was beating its wings against her ribs. Each thump of her heart was a countdown to discovery. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the stone hearth, and outside, the blizzard shrieked like a vengeful spirit. She handed the first bowl to Captain Kael. His eyes, sharp and weathered, met hers for a moment too long. He was not looking at her. He was reading her. She felt exposed, a page of secrets he was trying to decipher. Her fingers brushed his as he took the bowl, his skin calloused and cold. She pulled back as if burned. She could feel her children beneath the floorboards, a silent, precious weight in the darkness of the root cellar. She imagined them huddled together, their small bodies trembling, their breath misting in the cold earth. "Be quiet, my loves," she prayed, "just for a little while longer. Be quiet." The soldiers ate with the grim efficiency of men long on the road. The only sounds were the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls and the relentless howl of the storm. Alara stood by the hearth, pretending to warm her hands, but she was really listening. Listening past the fire, past the wind, past the breathing of the men, down into the earth beneath her feet. Every creak of the floorboards under a soldier's shifting weight was a thunderclap in her mind. The worn bearskin rug that covered the cellar's trapdoor seemed to glow with a faint, incriminating light. "You have our thanks for the shelter and the meal," Captain Kale said, his voice cutting through the quiet. He set his empty bowl down. "It is a bitter night to be caught in the peaks." Alara simply nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She kept her eyes on the flames, hoping he would mistake her tension for shyness. "We were tracking Barogi Wolf," he continued, his tone conversational, but his gaze was analytical. "A large male, driven from its pack. Dangerous, but I confess, finding a lone woman living in these parts is more surprising than any wolf." Here it comes, she thought. The dance begins. She had rehearsed this 1,000 times, whispered the laws to the empty cabin until they felt almost true. She turned from the fire, forcing a weary, sad smile. "The solitude has its own kind of peace," she said, her voice soft. One of the younger soldiers, a boy with downy cheeks who couldn't be more than 20, looked around the small, tidy space. "But to be entirely alone, it's a hard life. Forgive me for saying so, mistress." Alara's gaze flickered to him, then back to Kael. Hardship is a matter of perspective. Kale leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. The firelight carved deep lines into his face. My man is right. These mountains are unforgiving. What would bring a woman to seek peace in a place like this? His question was gentle, but it had the weight of an order. She clutched her hands together, the faint, silvery scar on her wrist, a cold reminder of her past. She had to give him a story he could believe, a tragedy that would satisfy his curiosity and make him look no further. My husband, she began, letting her voice tremble just enough. He was a hunter. Born in the shadow of these peaks, he used to say the city air choked him. She looked down at her hands, focusing on the pain of a life she never had to make the lie feel real. He taught me how to live here, how to read the snow, how to find food. This cabin, this was our home. Kale's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Was, he prompted. Elara took a slow, shaky breath. There was a rock slide 2 winters ago. He was checking his traps in the high passes. She didn't need to fake the tears that pricked her eyes. They were real tears, for a real loss, just not the one she was describing. They were for Theron, for the life they were supposed to have, for the children who would never know their father as the man she had once loved. After he was gone, the thought of returning to the city, it was too much, too loud, too full of people. This is all I have left of him. The cabin fell silent again. The young soldier looked down at the floor, his face filled with pity. Another cleared his throat uncomfortably. Elara felt a small, bitter victory. She had given them a ghost to occupy their thoughts, a dead husband to explain her presence. But Captain Kale was not so easily satisfied. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Your accent, he said, his voice losing its gentle edge. It's not of the mountains. It's from the capital. Refined. I have spent my life in the king's service at Stonehold. I know the sound of it. Ice flooded Alara's veins. This was the one detail she could not change, the one part of her she could not shed. The way she spoke was a map that led directly back to the life she had fled. Her mind raced, scrambling for a foothold. I was not always a hunter's wife, she said, her voice strained. She forced herself to meet his gaze. She had to sell this part of the lie more than any other. My family were merchants in the capital. They disowned me when I chose to marry a man of the mountains, a man they saw as beneath my station. She let a hint of old defiance color her tone. I chose him. I chose this life, and when he was taken from me, I had nowhere else to go. My family would not have me back, and this is my home now. It was a good lie. It was intricate, layered with class shame and lost love, a story that fit the world they knew. It explained her speech and her isolation in one clean stroke. She watched Kale, waiting for his reaction. He seemed to consider her words, his head tilted. He glanced around the cabin again, his eyes lingering for a moment on the small shelf where her wooden bowl sat next to 2 others, slightly smaller, slightly more worn. Her heart leaped into her throat. He had seen them. She was sure he had, but he said nothing. His gaze moved on, sweeping over the neatly stacked firewood, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. One of the soldiers, a big, burly man with a thick beard, stood up to stretch his legs. He groaned as his back popped. He took 2 steps away from the fire, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. He was walking directly toward the bearskin rug. Alara's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to shout, to stop him, but that would be the end. She could only watch, frozen, as his boot hovered over the edge of the rug. The storm sounds worse, he grumbled, changing direction at the last second to peer out the single, small window. He pulled the shutter tight against a gust of wind that rattled the frame. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She leaned back against the stone of the hearth, the warmth doing nothing to stop the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The captain was still watching her. He had seen her fear. She knew it. You are a strong woman to survive here alone, Kale said slowly, his voice now flat, unreadable. King Theron values strength. The sound of his name was a physical blow. It had been 6 years since she had heard it spoken aloud. 6 years of trying to erase it from her memory. Yet here it was, in her home, from the mouth of his most trusted man. She felt a wave of dizziness. The image of Theron's face flashed in her mind, not the cold, cruel king he had become, but the younger man, his molten gold eyes soft with a love she had believed was invincible, a love that had turned to ash. The king has no interest in the lives of forgotten widows in the mountains, she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. The king has an interest in everything that happens in his kingdom, Ko corrected her sharply. He has an interest in loyalty, and he has no mercy for those who betray it. His words were a threat, a clear, cold warning. Was he speaking of her? Did he somehow know? No, it was impossible. He was speaking of his king, of the ruthless reputation Theron had cultivated since she had vanished. A reputation built on pain, the pain she had caused him. She felt a pang of the old, familiar guilt, a wound that never truly healed. She had broken him, and in doing so had unleashed a monster upon the world. She had to end this conversation. She pushed herself away from the hearth, moving to collect the empty bowls. "If you will excuse me," she said, her voice tight. "It is late. I will prepare your sleeping rolls by the fire." It was a dismissal, a desperate attempt to reclaim some control over her own home. As she reached for Kael's bowl, their eyes met again. This time there was no pity in his gaze, only a hard, unyielding suspicion. He knew she was lying. He might not know the truth, but he knew this was a performance. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the intensity of his stare. He was a predator who had scented weakness, and he would not let go. The fragile calm she had fought so hard to maintain was crumbling. He held her gaze, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. The fire crackled. The wind howled its lonely song. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, a battlefield of secrets and lies. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground giving way beneath her feet. And then it happened. From beneath the floor, from the cold, dark silence of the cellar, came a sound. It was small, almost imperceptible, but in the suffocating quiet of the cabin, it was as loud as a scream, a tiny, dry, muffled cough, a child's desperate attempt to choke back a tickle in the throat. Time stopped. The crackling of the fire seemed to die. The wail of the wind faded to nothing. Alara froze, her hand hovering over the bowl, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. It was over. 6 years of running, 6 years of hiding, 6 years of terror, all undone by one small, innocent sound. The 4 soldiers fell completely silent. The young one's eyes went wide. The big man by the window turned slowly. Their heads swiveled in unison, their movements sharp and predatory. But they did not look at the floor. They all turned to look directly at Alara, 4 pairs of eyes filled with sudden, sharp understanding, pinning her in place. The lie was dead, and in its place stood a terrible, undeniable truth. The world stopped. The fire crackled. The wind howled its lonely song against the shutters. But inside the cabin, there was only the echo of a child's cough. It was a small sound, barely a whisper of air, yet it landed in the dead quiet with the force of a thunderclap. 4 pairs of eyes, once glazed with weariness, snapped into focus. They all turned away from the fire, away from their steaming bowls, and pinned Alara to the wall with their collective gaze. Her blood ran cold. The warmth from the hearth felt a million miles away. 6 years of vigilance, 6 years of whispered warnings and frantic heartbeats had just been undone by a single innocent cough from below the floorboards. Her mind screamed, "Make a sound, do something, anything to erase the last one." Her hand, already trembling, jerked sideways. It was not a conscious thought, but a primal, desperate instinct. Her fingers connected with the handle of the small iron pot sitting near the edge of the hearth. It tipped, wobbled for a sickening second, and then crashed to the stone floor. The clang was deafening, a brutal metallic shriek that ripped through the silence and made the soldiers flinch. It was a clumsy, obvious sound, a sound of pure panic. Alara forced a shaky laugh, the noise catching in her throat like a shard of glass. She bent down quickly, her long hair falling forward to hide her face, her hands fumbling for the pot. "Forgive me," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "I'm so clumsy tonight. The storm has me on edge." She risked a glance up at Captain Cahill. His face was a mask of granite. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, had not been fooled. They were not looking at the fallen pot. They were fixed on the floorboards directly in front of her. "That was not the sound I heard, woman," Cahill said. His voice was low, dangerously calm. It was the voice of a wolf that has scented its prey and knows there is no escape. The other soldiers shifted, their brief moment of relaxation gone. They gripped their knees, their bodies tensing, ready to stand at a word from their captain. One of them, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his eye, glanced around the small room. "Perhaps it was just a rat, Captain. This old wood is likely full of them." Ilara seized the excuse, her heart leaping with a sliver of false hope. "Yes," she agreed a little too quickly. "Rats. They grow bold in the winter, seeking warmth." She stayed on her knees, her body a shield over the hidden cellar door, hoping her presence would be enough to deter them. She could feel the faint vibrations through the wood as Liam or Lyra likely shifted below, terrified by the loud noise and the strange voices. "Stay still, my loves," she begged them silently. "Please, just stay still." Kael did not even look at his subordinate. His gaze remained locked on Alara, dissecting her, peeling back her desperate lie with his cold stare. "My men and I have tracked beasts and men through every forest and mountain in this kingdom," he said slowly, each word a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. "I know the sound of a rat scurrying in a wall, and I know the sound of a human cough." He rose to his feet. The movement was fluid, economical, and utterly menacing. The firelight glinted off the polished silver wolf's head clasp on his cloak. A terrible final certainty washed over Illyra. It was over. The game was lost. The fragile peace she had bought with 6 years of exile was about to be shattered. But instinct, the fierce, unthinking love of a mother, refused to surrender. She scrambled to her feet, placing herself directly in Kyle's path as he took a step toward the center of the room. "There is nothing here," she insisted, her voice trembling, but firm. "I live alone. I told you this." For a moment, Kale just looked at her. He saw the terror in her green eyes, the frantic pulse beating in her throat. He saw the defiance warring with absolute fear. He saw a cornered animal ready to fight a battle it could not possibly win. His expression held no pity. It held only duty. With a soft, metallic whisper that seemed to fill the entire world, he drew his sword. The blade was long and perfectly balanced, and a dark steel drinking the firelight. The other 3 soldiers were on their feet in an instant, their hands moving to the hilts of their own weapons. "Search the cabin!" Kale commanded, his voice now sharp with authority. He did not raise it, but the order cracked like a whip. The soldiers moved at once, their military training overriding any lingering sense of intrusion. One of them kicked over the small stool he had been sitting on. Another strode to the corner, where Alara kept her meager supply of firewood, scattering the wives with the toe of his boot. They began to tear her small world apart. The blankets on her bed were thrown to the floor. The few dried herbs hanging from the rafters were torn down. It was a swift, brutal, and efficient violation. Alara let out a cry of protest, a sound of pure anguish. "No, please stop. There is nothing to find." She tried to move toward them, to stop the desecration of her home, her sanctuary, but Kael blocked her way. He was a wall of black leather and cold steel. "Stand aside," he ordered. She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "This is my home. You have no right." He took another step forward, his sword held loosely at his side but ready. He was focused on the bearskin rug that lay in the middle of the floor, the very rug she had placed so carefully to hide the seams of the cellar door. She saw where his eyes were looking, and a fresh wave of ice-cold dread washed through her. She lunged, not to attack him, but to throw herself over the rug, to become a final, desperate barrier. "I said there is nothing there," she screamed. Kale's patience was gone. He did not strike her with his sword. The movement was quicker, more dismissive. He raised his free hand and pushed her. It was not a violent shove, but it was firm and unyielding. The force sent her stumbling backward. her heel catching on the uneven stone. She fell hard, landing in a heap near the hearth. The air knocked from her lungs. The side of her head struck the stone with a dull thud, and for a second the room swam in a dizzying haze of orange and black. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the agony in her soul. She lay there, helpless, watching him. One of the soldiers called out, "Nothing here, Captain, and I am just some old clothes and blankets." "Check the walls for loose stones," Cale commanded, without looking away from the rug. He walked forward until his boot stood at its edge. He nudged it with his toe. The thick fur slid easily over the smooth wooden floorboards beneath. Alara watched, her breath caught in her throat. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity of horror. There it was, revealed in the flickering firelight. A small, dark line in the wood that did not match the other planks, and set flush into the wood, a simple black iron ring. It was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Kael knew. He had been looking for something just like this from the moment he heard the cough. He lowered himself to one knee, his sword resting on his thigh. His armored glove reached out, his fingers closing around the cold iron ring. Alara's mind was a storm of silent screams. "No, no, please, not them. Take me, do what you want with me, but leave them." She tried to push herself up, to crawl, to do something, anything, but her body felt heavy as lead, paralyzed by a despair so profound it was a physical weight. She could only lie there on the cold stones and watch as the captain of the king's guard prepared to unearth her heart. She could hear a faint, muffled whimpering from below. It was Lyra. She was always the more sensitive one. Liam would be holding her, his small body tense, trying to be the brave protector he always wanted to be. The gazes of the other three soldiers were now fixed on their captain. The search had stopped. The cabin was utterly sterile again, the only sounds the moan of the wind and the crackle of the fire. All the air had been sucked out of the room. Kael looked up from the iron ring and met Alara's eyes across the small space. There was no triumph in his expression. There was only a grim, resolute finality. He had his orders. He had a duty to his king, and he would see it done. He took a deep breath, his broad shoulders tensing with effort. With a sharp grunt, he heaved upward on the ring. The wood, swollen with damp, protested with a loud groan. The hinges, rusted from years of disuse, screamed in protest. The heavy trap door, the final barrier between her children and the cold, cruel world of their father, began to lift. A wave of cool, damp air smelling of earth and fear washed up from the opening. A sliver of lantern light pierced the blackness below. Kael pulled the door all the way open, letting it fall back against the floor with a heavy thud that shook the entire cabin. He leaned forward, holding his lantern over the dark, square hole in the floor. The light cut through the shadows, illuminating what lay hidden in the small, cramped root cellar. Huddled together in the far corner, pressed against the cold dirt wall, were two small figures. A boy and a girl, their faces pale with terror, wrapped in a single wool blanket. They stared up into the sudden blinding light, their eyes wide and frightened, like captured fawns caught in a hunter's lamplight. The heavy wooden slab groaned as Kael tore it from the floor. A wave of cold, earthy air washed into the small cabin, carrying the scent of damp soil and stored roots. For a single stretched second, there was only the howling of the blizzard outside and the ragged sound of Alara's own breathing. Her blood ran cold, freezing in her veins. This was it. The end of 6 years of running, the end of everything. Down in the darkness, two pairs of wide, terrified eyes stared up into the lantern light. Lyra was a small, trembling ball behind her brother, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob. Alara's heart shattered. She had failed. Her beautiful, innocent children were caught in the hunter's snare, and she was paralyzed, standing uselessly as the wolves closed in. Kael's face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He had caught her in a lie. His eyes, hard as winter stone, swept over the two small figures huddled in the dirt. One of his men chuckled darkly behind him. "Well, Captain, looks like the widow isn't so alone after all." Alara tried to speak, to scream, to throw herself in front of the opening, but her feet were rooted to the floorboards. Her throat was choked with a silent, primal terror. All she could do was watch as the moment she had dreaded for 2,000 days finally unfolded. Kael lowered his lantern for a better look, his expression unreadable. His sword still held steady in his hand. The polished steel gleamed, catching the light. It promised a swift, cold end. Then something shifted in the cellar's gloom. Liam, who had been frozen just a moment before, took a shaky breath. He was small for his 6 years, but in that instant he seemed to grow. He squared his narrow shoulders and took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself directly in front of his sister. He was shielding her, a tiny, defiant guardian against the armored giants looming above. He lifted his chin, his small face a mixture of terror and childish fury. The movement was small, but it was enough. As he tilted his head back to glare up at the captain, the worn hood of his woolen cloak slid from his head. It fell away, pooling around his neck, revealing his dark, messy hair, his pale face, and his eyes. The cabin fell into an impossible silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant scream of the wind. Kael's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, audible hitch that cut through the tension. The lantern in his hand trembled, sending wild, dancing shadows across the walls. His gaze was locked on the boy's face. He wasn't looking at a child anymore. He was looking at something else entirely. The light from his lantern struck Liam's eyes, and they did not just reflect it. They absorbed it. They ignited. They burned with a light of their own, a luminous, impossible shade of molten gold. It was not the simple yellow of a wolf or the amber of a common man. It was the sun forged into a gaze. It was the unmistakable, undeniable, and terrifyingly rare color of the Royal Alpha line. It was the very color that haunted the dreams and nightmares of every subject in the kingdom. It was the color of King Theron's eyes. Alara saw the recognition dawn on Kael's face. It was not a slow understanding. It was a physical blow. The captain's hard-weathered features slackened. The suspicion in his eyes was vaporized, replaced by a profound, gut-wrenching shock that bordered on horror. His mouth fell slightly open. The knuckles on his sword hand went white, not with aggression, but with a desperate, disbelieving grip on reality. "He knows," a voice screamed inside Alara's head. "He knows. He sees the king. It's over." She braced for the order. She braced for the sound of a sword being drawn fully. She braced for the shout that would condemn her children as abominations, as genetic accidents of a forbidden union between an Alpha and an Omega. Her own exile was proof of the clan's disgust. What fate, then, awaited the proof of that union made flesh? Her mind flashed with images of fire and steel, of her babies being torn from her arms. She finally found her voice, a strangled gasp that was half plea, half curse. "No." But the order never came. The other soldiers, sensing the sudden, drastic shift in their captain, leaned forward. One of them muttered, "What is it, Captain? What do you see?" Kael didn't answer. He couldn't. He was lost, trapped in the luminous gold of the boy's stare. 6 years. For 6 years he had served a king hollowed out by grief. A king whose rage was a cold fire that had consumed the warmth of the entire kingdom. Theron's cruelty was legendary, born on the very night Alara had vanished. He had turned Stonehole Citadel into a fortress of sorrow and suspicion. He had executed lords for whispering her name. He had launched a relentless, kingdom-wide search that had never officially ended, a desperate, obsessive hunt for a ghost. Kael had seen Theron's pain up close. He had seen him in the throne room, his golden eyes cold and dead. He had seen him in the training yard, his movements filled with a violence that went beyond practice. And he had seen him in the quiet of his chambers, staring at a single withered winter rose, the last gift Alara had ever given him. Now that same gaze, that same fire, that same soul-deep gold was staring up at him from the face of a child hidden in a dirt cellar in the middle of the most remote mountain range in the kingdom. A child who belonged to the woman the king had lost his mind searching for, the woman he believed had betrayed him. The boy did not flinch. He held Kael's gaze, his small body trembling, but his eyes steady. Behind him, Lyra peeked out, and the lantern light caught her face for just a second. Her eyes were her mother's, a deep forest green. But then she blinked, and for a fleeting moment, a faint, telltale glimmer of gold shimmered within the green. Twins. It was all too much. The truth was a tidal wave, crashing over him, drowning him in its impossible weight. This wasn't just a secret. This wasn't just a lie. This was a lost prince, a hidden heir, the living, breathing reason for a king's 6-year descent into madness. The boy had Theron's face in miniature, the same strong jawline, the same defiant set of his brow. He was not just a child with the king's eyes. He was the king's son. The weight of the revelation was a physical force. Kale stumbled back a step, his boot catching on the edge of the bearskin rug. The movement was clumsy, uncharacteristic for the kingdom's most disciplined soldier. His sword arm, which had been rigid with authority just moments before, went limp. The tip of the blade dipped, lowering until it pointed harmlessly at the wooden floor. The full, world-altering implication of what he was seeing washed over him, a cold and terrifying flood that swept away every order he had ever been given, every certainty he had ever known. The world narrowed to a single point of light, the lantern in Captain Kael's hand. It illuminated the impossible, the secret she had guarded with her very soul for 6 years. He had seen. His sword was lowered, but his body was rigid, a predator coiled to strike. Elar's mind screamed, a sharp, soundless shriek that vibrated behind her teeth. This was it, the moment she had rehearsed in countless nightmares. The discovery, the end. Her children would be dragged out. Their special, beautiful eyes would condemn them. They would be called abominations, mistakes, a stain on the Alpha King's pure bloodline. A wave of cold fire washed over her, burning away every last trace of fear and replacing it with something primal. A mother's fury. Her breath hitched, a ragged tear in the fabric of the sudden, heavy silence. The soldiers behind Kael were frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror as they craned their necks to see into the cellar. They would follow their captain's lead. When he moved, they would move, and he would move. He had to. He served Theron, the king whose heart had turned to ice, whose justice was swift and unforgiving. He would see this not as a miracle, but as a deception, a final, hidden betrayal. He would eradicate the evidence. He would eradicate her children. A guttural sound ripped from Elar's throat, and she moved. Not away, not to hide, but toward the threat. Her body was a blur of motion, fueled by 6 years of suppressed terror, finally erupting. Her bare feet barely registered the cold floorboards as she lunged past the soldiers, her hand closing around the familiar, rough-hewn handle of the firewood axe propped against the hearth. She spun around, hoisting the weapon. It felt heavy, clumsy, but it was a piece of the mountain, a piece of her life here, and she would use it to defend her young. Her wild eyes locked onto Kael. He was still staring into the cellar, his posture unreadable. The other men flinched at her sudden aggression, their hands instinctively moving to the hilts of their own swords. "No," she snarled, the word torn from her very core. "You will not touch them." The promise was absolute, a vow sealed in blood and desperation. They would have to go through her. She would paint the floor of her tiny, pathetic cabin with their blood or her own before she let them lay a single hand on Liam or Lyra. She braced herself for the charge, for the clash of steel, for the brutal final fight. But the attack never came. Instead, something utterly incomprehensible happened. Captain Kael, the hardened leader of the king's elite guard, tore his gaze from the children and looked at the axe in her hands. He saw the feral desperation in her eyes. He saw a mother wolf cornered and ready to die. And then, he did not raise his sword. He did not call an order. With a sharp, metallic clank of his greaves hitting the floor, he dropped to one knee. His head bowed, the plume of his helmet brushing the dusty floorboards. The hand that had held his sword now rested on his thigh, palm open, utterly disarmed. The gesture was so profound, so completely opposite to the violence she had anticipated, that it stopped the breath in her lungs. The axe in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The other 3 soldiers stared, their mouths slightly agape. They looked from their kneeling captain to the wild-eyed woman with the axe, and then their gazes were drawn back to the cellar opening. One of them, a younger man with a faint scar on his chin, took a hesitant step closer. He peered down and his eyes widened. He saw what Kael had seen. He saw Liam standing protectively in front of his sister, and he saw the boy's eyes. Luminous, defiant, in the unmistakable color of molten gold. The soldier gasped, a sharp intake of breath that was loud in the suffocating quiet. He stumbled back, his face pale with shock. Without a word, he too dropped to his knees, his movements jerky, uncoordinated, as if his own body were betraying him. The remaining two soldiers exchanged a look of sheer disbelief. Then, as one, they moved to the edge of the opening. They saw Lyra peeking out from behind her brother, her own golden eyes wide and curious. They saw the undeniable mark of the royal bloodline, a trait so rare it was spoken of in legends, a genetic signature that belonged to one man and one man only. King Theron. The realization struck them like a physical blow. A muffled curse escaped one man's lips. Then, with the heavy, grating sound of metal and leather, they joined their comrades. They knelt, all four of them, four armed, hardened soldiers of the Wolf Clan, kneeling on the floor of a tiny remote cabin, their heads bowed in submission. Alara's mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Her arms began to tremble, the weight of the axe becoming an unbearable strain. This had to be a trick, a cruel, elaborate mockery before the final, terrible act. Theron was capable of such things. He had learned cruelty in the 6 years since she had left, or so the whispers that reached even these remote peaks had said. Maybe this was a new form of torture, a way to break her spirit before they broke her family. She tightened her grip on the axe handle, her knuckles turning white. The wood bit into her palm, a small, sharp pain that was the only real thing in a world that had just tilted on its axis. Then Captain Kyle lifted his head. He did not look at her, his gaze, filled with an emotion she had never seen in a man so hard, was fixed solely on the children. His voice, when he spoke, was not the clipped, authoritative tone of a soldier. It was thick, raw, and trembling with a profound, earth-shattering reverence. He looked at Liam, who stared back with a child's uncertain defiance. He looked at Lyra, who was now fully visible, her small hand clutching her brother's tunic. "My prince," Cale breathed, the words barely a whisper, yet they filled the entire cabin. He then turned his gaze to Lyra, his expression softening even further into pure, unadulterated awe. "My princess." The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. Prince, princess, titles of fairy tale and legend, titles that belonged in the cold stone halls of the citadel, not in her dusty root cellar. They were words of power, of lineage, of destiny, words she had fled from, words she had taught her children to fear, and now they were being spoken by the very men she thought had come to destroy them. Her thoughts scattered like panicked birds. This couldn't be real. It was a fever dream, a madness brought on by years of isolation and fear. She was hallucinating. The soldiers were not kneeling. They were about to stand up, their faces twisting into cruel sneers, and the nightmare would begin again. But they didn't move. They remained on their knees, a silent, imposing testament to a truth that had just rewritten their world. The blizzard howled outside, a wild and mournful sound that seemed to come from another universe. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the soft whimpers of Lyra, and the frantic, hammering beat of Alara's own heart. From the cellar, Liam's small voice piped up, filled not with fear, but with genuine confusion. "Mama?" he asked, his golden eyes flicking from the kneeling soldiers to his mother's face. "Why are they on the floor?" He did not understand the titles, the politics, the danger. He only saw that the scary men were no longer scary. They were low, and he was high. Alara couldn't answer. Her throat was tight, her tongue a useless weight in her mouth. She looked at Kyle, his face, weathered by years of campaigns and unquestioning loyalty to his king, was transformed. The suspicion was gone, the hardness was gone. In its place was a look of utter devotion. This was not a trick. You could not fake that expression. It was the look of a man who had just found something holy, something he had thought lost forever. He was not seeing two children of a disgraced Omega. He was seeing the lost heir of heirs of the kingdom. He was seeing the future of the Wolf Clan. He was seeing his king's salvation. Her mind spun back through time to a hidden alcove in the royal gardens. Theron's arms were around her, his deep voice a rumble against her ear. "They see you as a weakness, Alara. he had whispered, his hand resting on her still flat belly. But they are wrong. You are my strength, and whatever comes from us will be the strength of this kingdom. She had believed him then, but the whispers of the court elders, their venomous promises to cleanse the bloodline of any Omega taint, had been louder than his love. She had run, not from him, but for them, for the secret life growing inside her. She had believed their birthright was a death sentence. And now these men, Theron's men, were proving her wrong in the most staggering way imaginable. They were not here to cleanse the bloodline. They were here to worship it. The entire foundation of her 6-year exile, the central pillar of her terror, crumbled into dust. She had been running from a threat that it seemed did not exist in the way she had imagined. Or had it changed? Had Theron's grief over her departure somehow altered the political landscape? Had his pain made him cherish the idea of what they had created, even if he never knew it was real? The questions were a dizzying spiral, pulling her down into a chasm of confusion. The firewood axe was still raised in her hands, a useless weapon against an enemy that had surrendered without a fight, an enemy that now looked at her children with the same fierce loyalty they gave their king. She was the one holding the weapon now. She was the one who looked like the aggressor, a cornered animal snarling at those who came to kneel. The absurdity of the situation was a fresh wave of shock. Elara slowly, mechanically lowered the axe until its iron head rested on the floorboards with a soft thud. Her fingers remained locked around the handle, her only anchor in a world that had become fluid and strange. She stared at the bowed heads of the 4 soldiers, their powerful forms made humble in the flickering lantern light. They had come as hunters, tracking a rogue wolf in the storm, and they had found the lost cubs of the Alpha King. Elara froze, axe in hand, utterly bewildered as the soldiers who came to hunt her now knelt before her children. The weight of the firewood axe in Alara's hands was suddenly immense. A moment ago, it was an extension of her will, a desperate promise of defiance. Now it was just heavy wood and crude iron. Her muscles screamed in protest, locked in a state of shock that held her body rigid. The 4 soldiers, the harbingers of doom she had feared for 2,000 days, were on their knees, not in surrender, but in reverence. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of wet wool, hot metal, and an impossible truth. The words, "my prince, my princess," echoed in the cramped space, refusing to fade. They hung in the air like smoke, twisting the reality she had so carefully constructed for 6 years. Captain Kael did not move. He remained on one knee, his head bowed, his sword resting point down in the snow-dusted floorboards. The fire crackled, oblivious. From the cellar, Lyra whimpered and scrambled to her mother's side, burying her face in the rough fabric of Alara's trousers. Liam, however, stood his ground. He stared at the kneeling captain, his small chin held high, his golden eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored his mother's. He had been taught to fear these men, to hide from them. He did not understand why they were now looking at him as if he were the sun. Alara's breath came in a ragged, shallow gasp. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. A cruel, elaborate game to make her lower her guard before the final, terrible blow. They would rise in a moment, their swords would flash, and the life she had clawed from the unforgiving mountains would end in a red smear on the floor. Her knuckles were white around the axe handle. She could still swing it. She could take one of them with her. It was the only thought that felt familiar, the only instinct that had not been paralyzed by the scene before her. Slowly, as if sensing the storm of terror and violence brewing inside her, Kael lifted his head. His gaze was not on the children, but directly on her. His face, weathered by 100 campaigns and 1,000 cold nights, was stripped bare of all authority. In its place was something Elara had not seen on a man's face in a very long time. It was a mixture of awe and profound, aching regret. "Elara," he said, and her name from his lips was another shock, another crack in the foundation of her world. His voice was low, not a command, but a plea. "Please, put the axe down. No one will harm you. No one will harm the children." His words were gentle, but they did nothing to soothe the frantic pounding in her chest. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, the sound raw and broken. "Because the king has never allowed it to be forgotten," Kael answered, his eyes holding hers. "For 6 years, every patrol, every scout, every informant from the coast to the ice fields has carried your description. Every captain in the royal guard knows your face. We were not hunting a rogue wolf, my lady. We were always looking for you. A tremor ran through Alara's arms. The axe suddenly felt heavier. Her mind reeled, trying to process his words. Theron, he had been looking for her. She had imagined many scenarios over the years, that he had forgotten her in the arms of a more suitable, high-born alpha, that he had cursed her name, erasing her from the Citadel's records, that his rage at her departure had burned out, leaving only cold indifference. But this constant kingdom-wide search, it did not fit with the narrative of survival she had whispered to herself on lonely nights. He hates me, she stated, the words tasting like ash. He would want me punished for fleeing, for shaming him. The exile's mark on her wrist seemed to burn with a phantom heat. A flicker of pain crossed Kael's face. He glanced at the other soldiers, who remained as still as statues, their eyes fixed on the floor. My lady, he began, his voice dropping even lower, as if sharing a sacred and terrible secret. You do not understand. The king you remember, the one who laughed in the gardens and stole glances at you in the great hall. That man has not been seen in Stonehold for 6 years. He vanished the morning you did. Alara's mind flashed back against her will, a memory, sharp and painful. Theron, his golden eyes bright with a fire that had nothing to do with rage, his hand tracing the line of her jaw. He had promised her the world, a world where the rigid laws of Alpha and Omega did not matter, a world where their love was the only law. She had believed him, with all the foolish hope of a girl who had never known a gentle touch. The king who rules now, Kael continued, pulling her from the drowning memory, is a man made of ice and fury. He is merciless. He is cold. He has tripled the size of his armies and expanded the borders through sheer, relentless force. The court whispers that he is a tyrant, that his heart has turned to stone. Kael paused, and his next words were heavy with the weight of personal testimony. They are wrong. His heart is not stone. It is a ruin that he papers over with edicts and battles. The cruelty you have heard of, the iron grip, it is not the mark of a monster. It is the mark of a man in unending agony. Alara stared at him, her lips parted. She felt a dangerous, treacherous crack in the wall of her own bitterness. For years, Theron's rage was a predictable threat, a monster she could understand and run from. But Theron's grief? A grief so vast it reshaped a kingdom? That was a creature she did not know how to face. It was more terrifying than any sword. It meant he had not forgotten. It meant he had felt her absence like a phantom limb. He thinks you abandoned him, Kael said softly, his words confirming her deepest fear. He believes you betrayed him, that you fled with another. The elders fed him this story. They told him an Omega's heart was fickle, that your love was a lie to gain position. He did not believe them at first. He tore the Citadel apart looking for you. For 2 months, he was a madman. But as the seasons turned and no word came, the poison took root. Alara flinched as if struck. The elders, of course. She could see their faces, particularly Elder Maeve, her eyes like chips of flint, her voice a venomous whisper. An Omega's womb is a disgrace to the royal line. Any child born from it will be considered a blight, a weakness to be cut out before it can infect the clan. The threat had been clear. She had not fled from Theron. She had fled to protect the tiny secret lives growing inside her from the vipers in his own court. But he would never know that. He would only know the silence she left behind. He did not know, she breathed, the words barely audible. It was not a question. It was a statement of dawning horror. He never knew I was with child. Kael's gaze shifted to Liam and Elira, who were now clinging to their mother's legs, sensing the immense, invisible weight that had settled in the room. His expression softened with a sorrow that seemed ancient. No, my lady, he did not know. He has mourned one loss for 6 years. He has no idea that he has been robbed of so much more. The firewood axe slipped from Alara's numb fingers. It clattered onto the wooden floor with a dull thud that made everyone jump. The sound broke the spell. The threat of violence was gone, replaced by a suffocating, complex sorrow. She was no longer a cornered animal fighting for her life. She was a woman standing in the wreckage of a past she thought she had outrun. A past that had just found her, not with a sword, but with a truth more devastating than any blade. She sank to her knees, pulling her children into a fierce embrace. She buried her face in Liam's dark hair, inhaling the familiar scent of pine and boyish mischief. She felt Lyra's small hands patting her back, a clumsy attempt at comfort. They were real. They were safe. But the world she had built to keep them safe had just been obliterated. The mountains were no longer a sanctuary. They were just a holding cell, and her parole was over. Captain Kael finally rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. The other soldiers followed suit, their awestruck gazes still fixed on the children. They did not sheathe their swords, but they held them loosely, no longer as weapons, but as symbols of their station. Their allegiance had been realigned in a single staggering moment. "My lady," Kael said, his tone now carrying a new formal authority. "When we left Stonehold, my orders were to patrol the Greyfang Peaks and quell any rumors of rogue clansmen. Those orders have changed." Elara looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She already knew what he was going to say. She felt it like the coming of a winter storm, a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones. "By the authority of the king and by the undeniable evidence of the royal bloodline," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "you and the royal children are to be escorted to Stonehold Citadel at once. You are under the protection of the king's first legion." Protection. The word sounded like a sentence. Protection meant returning to the place of her greatest fear. It meant facing the court that wanted her erased. Most of all, it meant facing Theron. Not the boy she had loved in secret, but the cold king his absence had created. A man who now had two more reasons to feel betrayed. Two living, breathing secrets she had kept from him. His children, his heirs. The blizzard outside had lessened, the wind no longer screaming but sighing through the pines. The world was quieting, preparing for the next chapter. Elara's gaze drifted from Kael's determined face to the three soldiers standing like sentinels by her hearth. Their loyalty was no longer in question. It was absolute. But it was not to her. It was to the golden eyes of her son and daughter. She looked at the kneeling soldiers, men of iron and duty, now humbled before the legacy she had hidden in the wilderness. Then she looked at her children, their faces full of worry and wonder, oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their lives. Elara realized her 6 years of running were over. The world dissolved into a series of fractured moments. One moment, the axe was heavy in her hands, a desperate last resort. The next, it was being gently pried from her numb fingers by a soldier whose face was a mask of stunned reverence. Her home, the one she had built with her own two hands, was no longer hers. It was now a royal nursery, a holy site. Captain Kael rose from his knee, his movements stiff with a new and unfamiliar deference. He did not look at her. His eyes, like those of his men, were fixed on Liam and Lyra, who were still blinking in the sudden light from the cellar. The cabin was dismantled with quiet, terrifying efficiency. Her worn furs and patched clothes were set aside. In their place, the soldiers produced bundles of soft wool and thick, dark cloaks lined with rabbit fur. They were for the children. For her, there was only a simple, coarse brown cloak, the kind a servant or a prisoner might wear. The distinction was not lost on Elara. She was the vessel, the inconvenient secret keeper. They were the prize. Liam and Lyra, overwhelmed and silent, allowed themselves to be dressed. They looked like tiny lords in their new finery, swallowed by fabrics they had never felt before. Lyra kept stroking the fur on her sleeve, her brow furrowed in confusion. Elara's few possessions, a wooden bowl, a carved bird for Lyra, a smooth river stone for Liam, were packed into a saddlebag as if they were precious relics. It was a violation. Every object held a memory of their quiet life, a life that was now being packed away and sealed. Kael directed his men with clipped, respectful whispers. "Gently with the prince's things. Ensure the princess is warm." The words echoed in the small cabin, alien and monstrous. Prince, princess. The titles landed on her children like heavy stones. Outside, the blizzard had broken. The world was a blinding expanse of fresh white snow under a pale, watery sun. 4 large war horses stood waiting, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were creatures of a different world, immense and powerful, their tack gleaming with the silver wolf emblem of the royal guard. Two smaller, calmer mares were brought forward, one for her, one for the children to share, seated in front of a soldier. Lyra buried her face in Alara's side, suddenly afraid of the huge animal. Liam, however, stared at the war horses with wide, curious eyes. His fear was being rapidly replaced by a 6-year-old's sense of adventure. Cale helped her mount the mare. His touch was impersonal, firm, the touch of a jailer. "We must make haste," he said, his voice low. "The king is not a patient man." Alara flinched at the mention of him. The king, not Theron. The name she had once whispered in the dark was now a title that promised only judgment and fury. She pulled Lyra into her lap, her arms a tight cage around her small body. Liam was lifted onto another horse, seated securely in front of a young, stoic soldier who looked barely a man himself. The boy craned his neck, trying to see everything at once. The journey began. They moved in a diamond formation. A soldier in front, one behind, and Kael beside them. They were a shield for the children and a cage for her. The familiar crunch of snow under her own worn boots was replaced by the muffled thud of hooves and the jingle of harnesses. She was no longer in control of her own steps, of her own direction. She was being carried toward the one place on earth she had sworn never to see again. Her gaze swept over the gray-fanged peaks one last time. The jagged spires of stone and ice had been her prison for 6 years. But as they receded behind her, she felt an ache so profound it stole her breath. It had been a safe prison. For 2 days, they descended from the high passes. The world slowly bled from white to green. The crisp scent of pine and stone gave way to the damp, earthy smell of thawing soil. The children, after their initial shock, began to see it as a great game. They had never been on a horse before, never seen a forest that wasn't covered in snow. "Mama, look!" Liam would shout, pointing at a hawk circling high above. "Is that a real castle?" Lyra whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant, crumbling watchtower on a hill. Alara would force a tight smile, a nod. But inside, each exclamation was a twist of the knife. Their innocence was a beautiful, fragile thing she had nurtured in isolation. Now she was leading them into the very place that would shatter it. The soldiers were a constant source of fascination for them, and Liam, emboldened, started asking questions. "Is your sword heavy?" he asked the young soldier he rode with. The soldier, startled, glanced at Kael for permission. The captain gave a slight nod. "It is, my prince," the soldier answered, his voice cracking slightly. "It is forged to protect the royal line." Liam puffed out his chest. Alara saw it and her blood ran cold. He was starting to understand. The deference, the titles. He was learning a new kind of power, a power tied to the molten gold of his eyes, a power she had tried so desperately to hide from him. That night they made camp in a sheltered grove of ancient oaks. It was nothing like her cold, smoky cabin. The soldiers erected a large, sturdy tent for her and the children. A fire was built, and soon the smell of roasting rabbit filled the air. They were given fine tin plates and steaming cups of broth. Liam and Lyra ate hungrily, their cheeks flushed with the pain and the excitement. Alara barely touched her food. She sat slightly apart, watching her children being served by hardened warriors. One soldier, a man with a scarred face and hard eyes, carefully cut Lyra's meat into smaller pieces for her. Another offered Liam a water skin with a reverence usually reserved for a king. They were no longer just her children. They were heirs, and she was a ghost at their feast, an outcast with an exile's mark on her wrist, a brand that seemed to burn with shame under the firelight. Later, as the children slept soundly, wrapped in warm furs inside the tent, Kael approached her. He stood by the fire, his posture rigid, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "You are afraid," he stated. It was not a question. Alara stared into the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of cool tea she had not drunk. "I am a prisoner," she replied, her voice flat. "Prisoners are always afraid." "You are not a prisoner," Kael corrected, though his tone lacked conviction. "You are the mother of the heir, of 2 heirs. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "He searched for you, you know, for years. The king turned the world upside down looking for you." Alara gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. He did not search for me, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He hunted for a possession that was stolen from him. There is a difference, Borskijo. Kael's expression hardened slightly. You misjudge his heart. The man he is now was forged in the fires of your departure. He believed you betrayed him, that you fled with another. Alara's head snapped up, her green eyes flashing with a fury that surprised even herself. He believed that because it was the easiest thing for him to believe. Easier than believing his own court would conspire against an unborn child. Easier than believing the woman he claimed to love was in mortal danger. Her voice trembled with 6 years of stored bitterness. She remembered Theron's rage. It was not a simple anger. It was an alpha's fury, a possessive, all-consuming storm that shattered anything in its path. He had once turned that fury on a lord who had insulted her. She had felt protected then. Now she imagined that same terrible force directed at her for 6 years of deception. He would not see a mother who had saved her children. He would see a traitor who had stolen his legacy. His love was a cage, Captain, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. A beautiful gilded cage. I flew out of it to keep my children from being born inside it. He will never forgive that. Kael was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering light. He saw not a treacherous Omega, but a woman hollowed out by fear. Perhaps, he said softly, but he is their father, and he is your king. That is a truth we are all returning to face. He gave a slight bow and walked back to the perimeter of the camp, leaving Alara alone with the crackling fire and the suffocating weight of his words. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of rolling hills and winding dirt roads. They began to see more people, farmers in fields who stopped and stared at the royal escort, merchants on the road who quickly pulled their carts aside. Liam and Lyra drank it all in, their faces pressed against the sides of the horses, their whispered commentary a constant hum. Why do they all look at us, Mama? Liam asked. Alara pulled her own hood further down over her face. Because of the soldiers, my love, she lied. But she knew it was more than that. They were a spectacle, a mystery moving toward the capital. She felt the change in the air before she saw it. The land grew more orderly, the farms more prosperous. The road widened, paved with cut stone. The wolf banners of Stonehold began to appear, hanging from inns and guard posts. Her heart began to beat a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. Each beat was a step closer. Each breath was a moment less of freedom. The soldiers around them straightened in their saddles, their professionalism sharpening as they neared the seat of power. On the morning of the 5th day, they crested a high ridge. Captain Kael reined in his horse and pointed. There, he said, his voice holding a note of homecoming. Stonehold. Alara followed his gaze. There on the horizon was a dark silhouette clawing at the sky. It was not the beautiful sun-drenched citadel of her memories. From this distance, in the stark morning light, it looked like a jagged crown of black stone fused to the side of a mountain. It was a fortress of immense, brutalist power, its towers like teeth, its walls impossibly high. It did not look like a home. It looked like a tomb. It was the heart of the kingdom. It was the source of all her fear. It was Theron's throne. Lyra, sensing the sudden tension in her mother's body, looked up at her. Mama? She asked, her small voice full of concern. Alara did not hear her. All the air had been punched from her lungs. 6 years of running, of hiding, of breathless terror, all of it crashed down upon her in a single silent wave. The formidable silhouette of Stonehold Citadel appeared on the horizon, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. The iron gates of Stonehold Citadel closed behind them. The air tasted of cold metal and power, choking the memory of the mountains. Captain Kael stopped the procession in the main courtyard. The children will be taken to the royal nursery, he stated, his voice flat. They will be bathed and fed. Alara's blood ran cold. She grabbed Liam and Lyra, pulling them behind her. No, they stay with me. The words were a ragged whisper, but they held a raw ferocity. Kael's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. They are not in danger, my lady. They are heirs to the throne. He gestured to 2 stern-faced women in servants' gray. The king, however, wishes to see you, alone. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was the reckoning. She knelt, her hands trembling, as she smoothed Liam's hair. "Be brave for me," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I will come for you soon." Lyra's lip quivered. "But where are you going, Mama?" Alara could only kiss their foreheads before the servants gently guided them away. Liam looked back over his shoulder, his golden eyes wide with confusion and fear. She watched them disappear into an archway, a physical part of her soul being torn away. Two guards stepped forward, their hands resting on their swords. Her 6 years of running were over. The halls were just as she remembered, yet entirely different. The familiar tapestries of the wolf clan now seemed menacing. The snarling wolf heads, a promise of violence. The air was still and frigid. She was led not to the dungeons, but toward the heart of the citadel. Toward the throne room, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The colossal oak doors swung open, revealing the immense space within. High windows cast long, skeletal fingers of light across the floor. At the far end, upon a throne carved from a single block of black obsidian, sat King Theron. He was a statue of fury. The silver at his temples had spread, framing a face that was harder and colder. But the eyes were the same. Those molten gold eyes, now burning with cold fire, were fixed on her. The guards escorted her to the center of the hall and then retreated, leaving her utterly alone. Finally, he spoke. His voice was not the warm baritone she remembered. It was a low, dangerous rumble. 6 years, he said, the words dripping with venom. For 6 years, I have imagined this moment. I have imagined you dead. I never imagined you would have the audacity to simply walk back into my kingdom. Alara's throat was too dry to speak. "Where did you go?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You vanished from my bed, from my life. No note, no word. I tore apart 3 territories searching for a ghost." "Theron, please," she managed, her voice cracking. "Do not speak my name," he snarled, leaning forward. "You lost that right the day you fled like a thief. I gave you my protection, my trust, and you repaid me with betrayal." "It wasn't like that," she whispered, tears finally breaking free. "I had to leave. I was trying to protect you." He let out a short, brutal laugh. "Protect me? From what? From whispers of the court? I was the king. I would have burned this citadel to the ground for you. But you ran. You chose fear over me." Now he was on his feet. He descended the steps, his movements slow and deliberate like a predator. "I searched for you until I went mad," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw growl. "Every sunrise was a new torment." The grief curdled into rage. "And with that rage, I built an empire. I rule with fear, Ilara. You taught me that love isn't a weapon." He was close now, so close she could smell the leather and cold steel that clung to him. "I never betrayed you," she cried, her desperation making her bold. "For what then?" he roared. "For your own selfish freedom? Did you find a quiet life with some simple man?" He grabbed her arm, his fingers like iron bands. "Now you are back, and you have brought children into my lands. Who is the father, Alara? Tell me the name of the man you chose over your king." The accusation was so monstrous, it shocked her into silence. He truly believed she had left him for someone else. "You are a fool," she spat, her own anger erupting. "You see betrayal everywhere because you are blind." His face contorted with fury. He raised his hand. At that moment, the great doors of the throne room swung open again. Captain Kyle stood in the doorway, his expression grim. Then from behind his legs, 2 small figures darted into the room. "Mama!" Lyra's cry was a tiny sound in the immense hall. Liam and Lyra ran across the stone floor. They had heard the shouting. Liam placed himself in front of her protectively while Lyra clung to her leg, burying her face in Alara's tunic. Theron froze, his hand still in the air. His world-ending tirade died in his throat. He slowly lowered his arm, his gaze dropping from Alara's defiant, tear-streaked face to the 2 children at her feet. He looked at the little girl hiding her face. Then he looked at the boy, who stared back up at him with a fierce, childish anger. Theron saw the boy's dark hair, so like his own. He saw the defiant set of his jaw. And then he saw his eyes. He saw his own molten gold eyes staring back at him. The silence in the throne room was heavier than stone. Theron stood frozen, his rage from 6 agonizing years extinguished in an instant. He stared past Alara at two small faces peering from behind her legs, one defiant, one terrified. Both held his eyes. His own molten gold stared back. An impossible truth. Liam and Lyra clung to Alara, their small fingers digging into her tunic. They were her only anchor. The fury that had blasted her upon entering the room had vanished from the king. She saw the first crack in the dam that held back an ocean of his pain. Her voice was a raw whisper, torn from a throat tight with unshed tears. They were going to take them from me. From us. Theron's gaze finally lifted from the children to her face. The confusion there was so profound, it was almost childlike. His mind was trying to reconcile the woman he thought abandoned him, and the mother who had clearly suffered. Tears blurred the image of the fearsome king. "The elders," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They came to me after you left for the northern campaign. They knew I was with child. Your child." A flicker in his eyes showed he remembered. He had known. "They told me what a disgrace it was," she continued, the memory a fresh wound. An alpha king and an omega. They said our love was a weakness, a stain on your legacy. They said any child born from me would be an abomination. I told them you would protect us, that you loved me." A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek. And they laughed. They said a king's love is secondary to his power. They told me that as soon as the child was born, they would correct the mistake, that they would spare you the shame. The heir left the room. Theron flinched as if she had struck him. The word correct hung between them, cold and vile. "I had to run," Alara choked out, her body shaking. "It was the only way. I couldn't tell you. They watched my every move. A letter would have been intercepted. I couldn't risk them." She gestured to the children, now watching their father with vain, curious eyes. "I didn't run from you, Theron. I have never stopped loving you. I ran for them." The iron mask of the merciless king shattered. His broad shoulders slumped. 6 years of cold rage, of brutal campaigns, had all been built on a lie. He pushed himself up from the throne, his movements slow and disconnected. He ignored the guards and Captain Kael. His world had shrunk to the 3 people who were everything he had lost. The heavy scrape of his boots echoed as he walked, not like a king, but like a pilgrim approaching a terrifying shrine. He stopped a few feet away. Alara instinctively tightened her grip on her children. But Theron's eyes held no threat, only a universe of regret. Liam, ever the brave one, took a hesitant step forward, studying the tall, sad man who looked so much like him. Then, the Alpha King, the Wolf of Stonehold, knelt. He sank to the cold stone floor until his eyes were level with his son's. He was no longer a king. He was a father. Slowly, as if afraid the boy might vanish, Theron raised a large, scarred hand. It trembled as he gently laid his fingers against Liam's cheek. Liam didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, a small gesture that sundered the last of Theron's composure. A choked sound escaped the king's lips. He looked from the boy's face up to Alara, his molten gold eyes filled with tears. The ice was gone, washed away by overwhelming love and profound grief. In his gaze, she bore it all. The lonely nights, the hollow victories, and the boss she had once loved, buried under a crown and a broken heart. Her own defenses dissolved, and the tears she had held back for 6 years began to fall. Theron's gaze was a plea for forgiveness. Still on his knees, he opened his arms wide. An offering, a surrender. Alara moved forward, a sob breaking from her chest as she pulled Lyra and Liam with her. She fell into his embrace, and his arms closed around all 3 of them with a desperate, crushing force. It was not a gentle reunion. It was a collision. Theron buried his face in her hair, his tears hot on her skin. He held his children, his hands splayed across their small backs as if he could weld them to him. The guards stood as silent witnesses. Captain Kael watched, a slow satisfaction on his face. The man he served had finally returned. Theron held them, rocking gently, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to Alara. He whispered her name, not with anger, but with reverence. A prayer, a promise.